Kate Milafalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. And this week I decided that we would set aside UFOs just temporarily, and maybe philosophy just temporarily, and direct politics, and do something that's kind of an intersection between two of my obsessions, politics and true crime. So we are going to do a book called Sympathy Vote, the investigation of the Valerie Percy murder. This is a look at an unsolved, allegedly, murder of the daughter of a U.S. senator. It happened in the 60s. I was a kid when it happened. I don't know why, but it caught my attention immediately. I have always followed this story and wondered why no progress was made beyond a certain point. And this book kind of explains it. It's very interesting. It jumps around a little bit because in order to put two and two together, you have to know about people other than the Percy family. Now, who are the Percys? He was a senator, but also his daughter was a twin, an identical twin. Valerie Percy was the identical twin sister of Sharon Percy. If that name rings a bell, it's because Sharon went on to marry J. Rockefeller, who became, I think, governor, maybe senator. He became a political big shot. I promised I wouldn't talk too much about politics. But this is a story that just goes to show you that political connections don't always guarantee that the wheels of a system work smoothly for the important people involved. They didn't necessarily benefit, although at first the response was dramatic. But they never really, well, it was never solved. But there's some psychology in this book that's really interesting. We learn about some people peripherally. It's absolutely fascinating. I hope you'll agree with me. I know I've been doing a little true crime story here and there, and I was just going to cover this very briefly, but then I found this book, and it was so interesting, I thought, oh, I have to share this. So, Sympathy Vote by Glenn Wall. Really a good book. Very easy to read. It flows. The chapters are short. That's always a plus when you're interrupted by life. So this book was written in 2013, and it goes right away back. So chapter 1, A Home on the Lake. So there's a big description of this home where they lived on Lake Michigan. It's been a couple of weeks. And it's very fancy. If you can see this picture, you know, this is beautiful where they lived. And I think this is, if this is a current picture, this is not from the time period. In 1923, this house was built right on the lake. 17 rooms. I make this joke all the time, but as somebody who does janitorial, my first thought is, who gets to vacuum that? Because I wouldn't want to. Anyway, 17 rooms, done in the Norman style, with Lake Michigan beach access. It was semi-private beach. We'll get to that. In 1962, Percy, who had bought it in the 50s, in 62, he added a pool house on the adjacent lot. So there was a 3-lot parcel of land, and the house was in the middle. One lot beside the lot with the house had a farmhouse, an old farmhouse, probably the original homestead, and the other lot was empty. So they kept the farmhouse for guests. They then rented it out. They lived, of course, in this big fancy, too much vacuuming house, mansion, and then the other lot was just left plain and then empty, and then in the front, like the house faced onto the lake. So they built a pool house, 45 by 20 feet, indoor pool, heated floors. This was very fancy for the time. It wasn't just a pool. There were facilities in there. There was two fancy bathrooms, a kitchen, and it had outside of it a flagstone patio. So this was quite the construction. And they also built a tennis court with a shelter to the southwest of the house. And this was built in 1950. So later the pool house came. The pool house had a 12 by 12 foot passage that joined the pool house to the main house. So it was right there with this hallway. It was actually an indoor type of hallway. And part of it, in the house end of it, was so large it was used as a dining area. So I always have a hard time in visualizing these places, and there are no pictures in the book of the interior of the house. There are pictures of the demolition of the house many years later, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So on the nearby third lot was the 19th century farmhouse, and they had bought this, after they bought the original house, then they bought that farmhouse and lot and the other lot in the 50s. So the driveway to the main house has parking in the front of the garage and in front of the pool house. So it's kind of like the house's back is turned to the main road and the driveway, and then you can, the focus, let's say just the focus of the house is really this sweeping back lawn with a drop that could be easily walked up and the beach on the pool, the lake. Lake Michigan, soon to become Lake Illinois, if Governor Pritzker has his way. So you have to watch my video on that. So this was all part of a 225-acre original farm in 1889, broken up into lots. Percy paid $75,000 for the original main house, and then bought the other lots like 7 years later. The main house, they say, was not a mansion, but I don't know. He rented out the farmhouse for $250 a month and eventually ended up not dealing with that and using it as a guest house. So this was outside the little community of Kenilworth, and the little community itself was 8 square blocks of hyper-rich. It was a hyper-rich enclave is how it's described. It only had 3 traffic lights and 2,900 people. So the main house, like I said, had this swath of lawn. There was a low stone wall and then kind of a dip down, a little bit of an decline down into the beach. And they call it a bluff, but it's not my idea of a bluff. It could be easily walked up or run up and down, no problem. But there were 2 stairways below the pool patio and in the corner that went down to the beach as well. Percy was a Christian Scientist, and I don't know if that really had much bearing on this particular event, other than his worldview. Really, it gave him strength after what happened, as you will see. He had been he'd been married. His first marriage was to a woman named Jean Valerie Dickerson, and sad to say, she died from a reaction to penicillin during a minor surgery in 1947. And this left him with these twin girls who were 6 years old and a little boy, Roger, who was 3 years old. So he remarried a woman named Lorraine, and they then had another girl and another boy. At the time of the writing of the book, Gail, the daughter, was 53, and Mark, the son, was 55. They were strict parents. They were conservative and strict. He was Republican, so his politics were conservative, but they also had real clear boundaries with their children. But it looked like a very close family. Tons and tons and tons of pictures of them on bicycles, on picnics, at the pool. I mean, they seemed to spend a lot of social time together. He wasn't, I'm looking for my control to turn off this noisy heater. He wasn't a kind of a distant father. He seemed quite involved with his children. So they expanded the garage in 1959 with 2 more spaces and 8-foot wide doors, and then they built a servant's quarter above it. So this was becoming quite the compound, really. They had this separate farmhouse as a guest house. They had this gigantic pool area with facilities. You could have slept in there if you wanted to, I suppose. And then the garage, they built an apartment above it for, the servants. Now we're starting to get into some things that don't get talked about a lot. In 1959, there was a prowler in this really wealthy neighborhood. Now, keep in mind, it was almost, I guess today we would call it semi-rural. There was the little town, which was a few square blocks, but immediately you left the center of this little village, you could call it, you got into kind of a semi-rural environment. Houses behind high walls, lots of foliage, trees, planting, very private, kind of winding country roads. This was not a suburban metropolis by any means. When they went to school, the 2 sisters, Sharon and Valerie, they were actually very popular, and they just went to the local public school, and people after the fact said you would never have known that they were the children of millionaires. They were just really down to earth, cheerful, friendly, no attitude. They were really nice. Percy made his money as the president of Bell and Howell. That will ring a bell, I'm sure. So he was a corporate CEO. And in early 1960, he installed in his house what was then a state-of-the-art security burglar alarm, and it had a 12-volt backup battery and chargers. So this was state-of-the-art. You couldn't get much better. There was a switch in the wall near the master bedroom, and it had a siren and an alarm on the top of the house outside. So if it triggered, somebody broke in, it would trigger the alarm, and then they would flip the switch, and the whole entire neighborhood would know that there was a problem. Now keep in mind, this is before 911, so this was clever. There were switches on the 3 first-floor windows, so you couldn't break into those windows. If they were compromised, the alarm went off, and the noise outside, and huge floodlights. So it was deafening. It was so bad that on rare occasions it would be accidentally triggered, and Percy would make his kids go around to all the neighbors and apologize. So, they were considerate people. In 1962, Valerie and Sharon started college. And Percy got more active in politics. He started out locally, and it expanded from that. He first started as the precinct captain for the 1960 Republican Platform Committee in his area. And Nixon actually came and stayed at the farmhouse and had a meeting there when he was at the Chicago Convention. In 64, Percy became the Republican candidate for governor of Illinois. And the reason he did it was the main GOP candidate had a heart attack and had to get out of the race. Interesting, we talk about him being a conservative Republican for the time, but the John Birchers hated him. He wasn't conservative enough for them. He kept his opinions to himself. He never badmouthed anybody. He didn't criticize his opponents politically or otherwise, and he didn't even talk to his family about it. Even his wife said that she had no idea what he thought of Goldwater. Goldwater was, very conservative. So he lost this first race that he entered, very, very close race, to the Democrat, a guy called Kerner, who, FYI, later was convicted of bribery in office. So there you go. So actually he went from being, in 6 months, from being just this rich CEO, but relative unknown, to being a huge big shot in Illinois politics, Republican politics. And in 1965, he became the candidate for Senate. He had full Republican support for this and was really advanced by them. Chapter 2, Trouble on Roslyn Road. So now we're going to start talking about the environment before they were even there. October 1st, 1951, a year before the Percy family bought the house and moved in. One of the neighbors of the eventual Percy house called the police complaining about a local kid, William Thornton. He was just 1 week shy of his 14th birthday. And he was bothering a local neighbor family called the Fife family. And this house that he was bothering was a block and a half from what became the Percy house. So keep this in mind. There's trouble in the neighborhood. The week after this report was made, Emil Tesk went to the police department with Richard Thornton in tow, probably by the nape of the neck. He was the 10-year-old brother of William, the 14-year-old. And the neighbor, Emil Tesk, was complaining that this 10-year-old boy had stolen money from his mother's purse. And the Thorntons were wealthy. And the police reaction was they told the 10-year-old, don't do that. So his father was William Thornton III. He was the second. He was a multimillionaire. He owned Great Western Steel of Chicago. His wife was named Kay, and his wife and children all called him Bill. A month later from this police report, the son William, the 14-year-old, ran away and was brought home by cops. So you're getting the picture here of a family in the neighborhood who was ultra wealthy, had a lot of pull with the police, and had two troubled children. That winter, Richard was back at the police station for having thrown a snowball at a woman who was driving, and the snowball hit her in the face. So, not the world's biggest crime, but it caused an accident, hurt somebody. In April of 1952, the 14-year-old William admitted that he was inside a neighbor's house, next door neighbor's house, several times without permission. And the family's name was Vanderhoff. So we're going to get this impression that these kids were out of control and not being watched. He denied damaging anything. And his younger brother, Richard, confessed to breaking windows in the Vanderhoff garage. So he's taken the fall because he's little. He's a little kid. A short time later, William was found with a microphone stolen from the church. He claimed he bought it at a rummage sale. The police report said how it got into the rummage sale, nobody knows, because the police believed him. Between mid-50s and June of 61, Richard's record grew. Now, this is the younger brother. The Vanderhoffs complained that he shot a gun in his backyard, that he attempted larceny at their house. He got charged with reckless driving and driving without a license. This is as he got old enough, And during the same time, William's record, the older brother, got worse than his younger brothers, by 8-1, the number of reports. At the age of 17, William escaped a mental ward, the Michael Reese Hospital of Chicago, where he had been committed by his father. So now we're getting an impression. This is not Leave It to Beaver. At home, he locked himself in his room, so he was isolating. He told his father and 2 house staff this one particular time, after he ran away from the mental hospital, that he had a shotgun and he would use it on anyone who tried to come into the room. 7 months later, armed with a .45, he stole a car the car that belonged to his parents. He didn't steal the car at gunpoint. He was armed with a .45. He took his parents' car. So the police, because they were geniuses, figured out that his anger was directed at his family. He claimed that he had a loveless childhood, that the children had been fobbed off on nannies and sent to boarding schools. He felt his parents owed him money for emotional hardship, just the misery they caused him. October 1955, right before his 18th birthday, he was in a mental facility in Winnetka. He escaped 5 days before his 18th birthday. The same day, he got handguns, 4 rifles, 3 shotguns, taken from his family home, and I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It's been a while since I read this. So he broke out 5 days before his 18th birthday. As soon as his family heard it, they collected handguns, 4 rifles, 3 shotguns, collected them all, took them to the police department, and asked the police to hang on to them and keep them safe for them. So he got home after the guns had been removed, and he was expecting at the age of 18 he would inherit something, and on his birthday he did not get any money from his parents. So he bided his time, and 3 years later, at the age of 21, he did not get an inheritance from his parents, and he lost it. He was furious, in a rage. Police kept newspaper story in his file that in 1957, he got stabbed in a dispute at a drive-in restaurant in Evanston. And he claimed that because of this stab wound, he had lifelong pleurisy, bad lungs, and being an invalid would explain some of his later issues. In late summer of 1957, the Chicago police and a detective came to the Kenilworth Police Department. They told the local cops that William and another guy by the name Frog had been picked up. Well, sorry, they did pick up 2 girls. I'm abbreviating my notes here. I'm leaving some crucial words out. These 2 guys, William, the delinquent rich boy, and Frog, young Master Frog, kidnapped 2 girls at a hamburger stand at a beachfront near Kenilworth on a Thursday, September the 5th. They actually lured them into the car, and in the car, the guys began to talk about removing, I hope you're watching right now because I don't want to say the words, and putting pieces in steel barrels and into the lake. One girl got freaked out, and she reported this to the Chicago police. They came to Kenilworth to the police. So the Kenilworth cops noted this little fact, that this whole story about body parts in steel barrels happened at the same time that a woman named Judith Anderson had been murdered and the case was being investigated. She was a 15-year-old Chicago girl who disappeared on the evening of August 16th, 1957. So that would have been approximately 2.5 weeks before these 2 guys picked the girls up, who eventually complained about the story. She disappeared while walking home from a friend's house, and 6 days later, steel drums were found in the Chicago harbor. Steel drums with her. 2 days later, the rest was found floating in a steel bucket in the harbor. William denied any kind of involvement, and he agreed to take a polygraph if asked. Interestingly enough, and they don't seem to have made the connection, keep in mind, his father owned the steel business, and he sometimes worked there temporarily. Traces of a substance used only in steelmaking was found within this barrel and within the barrels and bucket that were floating in the harbor. So William's father, as I said, owned the steel company and William worked for him. So this murder remains unsolved to today. So William had this ever-increasing police record in Kenilworth, and he was also known to the Winnetka cops, who once said that William had done battle, or that he had done battle with William in front of the high school in the early 60s. He noted that William responded to police with silence. Every time he got arrested or pulled over or questioned, he would just sit like a sullen lump. And the cops put two and two together and thought, well, he's just not wanting to incriminate himself. But there are those who say it might have been actually because he had a severe stutter. And I think that's a really important thing to remember when we talk about the psychology of this later. In winter of 1958, he met a 21-year-old Chicago teaching student, Louise Bannock. She found him handsome and dangerous. Perfect combination. He was 6'1", apparently. That was important to her. But he didn't settle down well with her. He dated other women. She found out. He was still getting into legal trouble. In June of 1959, he was booked for assault. He had driven his car over a guy's front lawn, and then when the police came, he led them on a police chase. 6 months later, he escaped his third escape from a mental facility in Galesburg. In 1960, his younger brother Richard was 17, and he had had more minor scrapes with the law. There was the issue of the gunshot, fired in the backyard. In 1958, he had tried to steal a car. On January the 1st of 1960, his brother William and Louise Bannock got married. And William, at that point, dedicated his life to trying to extract money from his parents. I mean, he just tortured his parents. Louise saw that he actually had money, and she discovered that his parents had been giving him bits of money here and there. Not the huge inheritance he wanted, but something to shut him up. He didn't have a job, and he actually admitted that he committed the crimes he committed for the thrills. So I think it's safe to say, allegedly, most of these people are dead, so, we're talking psychopathy here, probably. And that's because my psychiatric license is somewhere around here. This just sounds suspiciously like this sort of conscienceless, narcissistic, criminal versatility, and thrill-seeking. Those are all signs, so just keep that in mind. Propensity to violence in some people. 18 days after the marriage, his mother filed a malicious mischief complaint against him. I mean, this becomes tedious. It's unbelievable, the list of things. On April 8th of 1960, the cops spotted him with his wife, Louise, in Winnetka, and when a cop approached the car, only Louise was in the car. So the cops thought they'd caught him, but they discovered very quickly that only Louise was in the car. She told them William was at his family home packing because they were planning on moving to Arizona. And they were last seen in town seen by the police driving at 2:15 a.m. The cops thought, oh, good, we're going to get rid of him, but no, we have more. Chapter 3, Escalation. By September of 1960, William and Louise were living in Tucson, Arizona. And it was on the news that they had been arrested by police in Maine for the theft of something, but they had given their address to the police in Maine as an address in Chicago, but they lived in Arizona. So you kind of see a pattern of deception and pathological lying. So put that on the psychopathic list. Actually, they were supposedly vacationing in Maine, and William stole 2 canoes and posters off of an office wall that belonged to a ferry service. So they broke into some sort of vacation ferry place and stole the canoes and stole the posters, and they got arrested. This was the first time for Louise to be arrested. August of 61, William was back home with his parents. His father asked the Kenilworth police to come to the house and help him because he was having physical fights with William again, who had been extorting more money from him. But they kept letting them move back into the house. In 61 and 62, his mother Kay filed assault and battery on William, but then dropped the charges. In July of 62, in Santa Monica, California, the police notified Willamette, someplace, that William had been convicted there of assault, but had pled down. The assault was the final charge, and it was a plea bargain that they made. And the original arrest was for forced adult interaction. There are words you can't use on YouTube. So March the 1st of 63, the Wilmette cops, they issued an assault and battery charges. William's crimes kept getting worse. They became more physical. In 63, his father filed a complaint of assault. They now had a 1-year-old. Great parents of the year, Michael. They usually lived in their house in Arizona. William quit a job that he had in an auto parts store. He was aimless and he was mad because his father had criticized the quality of the job. Louise later said that William paced the floor at nights and would leave her and the child for weeks, traveling the country to obtain military weapons, and he would go swinging in the Hollywood flesh pots. Those are her words. That's a quote. In Tucson, William was arrested for a prank. He set off bombs outside a local radio station. And Louise said that he did it at eerie hours of the morning. That's an interesting choice of words. William was not happy with Richard. He had stopped getting into trouble. He was going to university in Europe. He got as far away as he could. And Louise said that William was jealous because Richard was getting along with his parents, and he was rewarded for it by acceptance and approbation and approval, and just getting a college degree. William complained that I've never been sent to Europe, that kind of thing. He worried that Richard would inherit all the money and he'd get left out of the will. September 3rd of 64, Richard wrote a letter to William, and this letter was scathing. It was something else. He talked about the gaps, the lapses in their contact were a pleasure for him, for Richard, that his parents owed William nothing. His brother accused William of stealing letters that belonged to the family and of misquoting people, misrepresenting the relationships to his own advantage. The letter discussed a number of crimes that William had tried to drag his younger brother into in the past, and some he actually did commit because William coerced him, the breaking and entering, the stealing, that kind of thing. And he pointed out the age gap and said that William was 100% in control in these situations. Richard accepted responsibility for the role that he was involved in the crimes, and he offered restitution when he returned to the United States from school. He chastised William in this letter for not remembering his crimes, as William said, I don't remember any of that. He told William that his parents were not buying things for Richard, that he was buying them with his own money, that William was deluded. He called William a slob and an unmannered pig. He refuted William's accusations that Richard was emotional and subject to violence, and reminded William that William assaulted Richard. Quote, "I hope that I never see your sadistic, selfish face again," end quote. The letter mentions several thefts that he knows that William did recently, including stealing rifles from Sears. Quote, "You were a delinquent and you have grown up as a convict. Why are you always returning to their parents' house and causing trouble, as well as disfiguring your wife?" So, you can imagine what that was about. Chapter 4, The Thorson Family Reunion. I don't think they had t-shirts made. In 1964, that it's really obvious that Richard recognized that his brother was a psychopath and violent. So now they said it, so it's okay to say it. He knew that William was often at his parents' house demanding money. In 65, William was back in Kenilworth. He told Louise that he went to smooth over the differences with his parents and his brother. Richard was now back in Chicago for the summer, working for the father in Chicago. William rented an apartment in San Francisco for his wife and child. But first, all three moved back, William, Louise, and Michael, the baby, moved back into his parents' house to mend relationships. So I have all kinds of exclamation points here. What were they thinking? So Richard had his own apartment in Chicago and got lured, as this book puts it, lured back into William's sick world. The parents at this point were in their mid-60s, and they let the sociopath William back into the home. And once again, the calls from the house to the Kenilworth police resumed. July 18th, 1965, there was a disorderly conduct complaint from Kay, the mother, that Richard was throwing all the things in the attic down the stairs to the first floor. Kay apparently was a hoarder. Just to add a little something to the story, this big mansion that they owned was hoarded out. They had come home, and the parents had come home, and they couldn't get the front door open because the son had thrown everything hoarded upstairs against the door. July 21st of 65, so 3 days later, Bill, the father, went to the station and asked the cops to come to the house because his son was home. William and his wife were told to leave your house. And Richard said this happened over and over. They removed themselves from the house, they returned. They removed, they returned. William left, he came back. This was ongoing. And there's something here apparently that was too complicated to copy out. Oh, these are police reports. These are interesting. 1:50 a.m., officer requests assistance at the house. 2 cops answered. Richard had returned, but he left when the police arrived. They received the report. This is later, 2 hours later. They received reports of someone screaming. Both Winnetka and Wilmette sent police cars to the area. 4:30, they got calls from all these different addresses that a man in the area was screaming outside. Richard Thorson called by phone, stating that he wasn't in Kenilworth and hadn't been for the past 4 hours, and he wasn't to blame for the commotion. How did he know there was a commotion? At 5:15, Richard called again and said he was going to get an attorney before he talked to anyone. The chief had a conference with Mr. Thorson and his wife, and they were advised, quote, "We will not tie up this department at your home for domestic problems. We will answer all calls, but complaints must be signed at the time or we will leave." Mr. Thornton was advised to obtain a court order prohibiting his sons from entering the home. This goes on. I'm not going to read I'll read part of it, but not all of it. 5 days later, there was a break-in, and then both brothers moved back into the house, and the whole cycle began again. This is really toxic. They made fake calls, fake complaints to the police to come to the house, to report disturbances, and the calls were in Richard's voice. It was recorded, and they were in Richard's voice. complaints that Richard was on the roof of the house screaming across the neighborhood. They tried to get the fire department to come and take him down. They showed up. The roof was searched, but apparently he had gotten down in the dark and nobody knew. And then other people called and complained about people in a ditch alongside a home. And just injunctions, complaints, phone calls, police being called out, fire department being called. This just goes on and on and on. There was quite a bit of it in this book. There's an impressive list of criminal activity. So the next day after this one event, the brothers were back. The cops were called to negotiate a conversation between the parents and the brothers. The father agreed to talk separately at an attorney's office. 3 neighbors called the police. The brothers were yelling at the father. They had a 3x5 file on him, and it was left on the front stoop, and the mother took it in, and 26 hours later, back in the neighbor's yard, the brothers are back there screaming again, and the cops told them to leave, and they said, well, they didn't want to leave. They wanted to speak to their parents. The next day, the father's at the police station again, filing reports. The mother began not sleeping at home. She was afraid. She stopped sleeping at home. So the day after the mother made that decision, the father signed a complaint. He had been reluctant to be official about the whole thing. He would go in and complain. The police would take a report, but the father wouldn't sign an official complaint. So this day he did at the state's attorney's office for burglary. And he hired a private investigator to be at the house every night armed. 3 weeks later, the reports from the father were that 2 cars that they owned were wrecked. At this point, William was 27 and Richard was 23. 3 days of quiet happened, and then back they came on September 12th. But the father reported all of this to the cops, and there was a warrant put out for their arrest because they took the parents' cars. The mother called the police. The boys were in the driveway with no shirts on. Oh, no. The police couldn't locate them. They tried. September 21st, Lake Forest called. Richard had been shot with a bullet in his head, and he needed to be ID'd. The parents went, and his father identified his body at the age of 24. The bullet was from a handgun that was found in their rental car. When they found it, William was high at the time of the shooting. I don't think it says what it was he was on, but it's not a big stretch to imagine. Louise ID'd the gun as Richard's. She said, she was estranged from William, that William gave it to Richard as a gift. And that she went to Richard to buy it a few days beforehand. So this was a purchase that was his gift, and she helped him buy it. The coroner's jury was not able to determine if this was murder or something else because he was left-handed and he was shot behind his right ear. So, yeah, 2 + 2, right? September of 65, his father withdrew his complaint that he'd filed with the state's attorney against William. He went to visit a friend, and he saw a very expensive painting that belonged to him hanging in the friend's house. And he said, you know, that's my painting. And it was returned to him, and they gave it to the police for safekeeping. So William, conveniently, is now the sole heir. He moved his wife and his child into a 3-story colonial mansion in Pacific Heights in San Francisco, of course, anticipating that he would inherit a lot of money. Chapter 5, John McDonough. So now enter a new character in this cast of characters. So William's busy figuring out how to spend the money he's sure he's going to inherit now that his brother is conveniently dead. Chapter 5, John McDonough. McDonough, in 1965, was 23 years old, and in 65 and 66, he worked both summers at Kenilworth Police Department. He had graduated college in 1963, and he got this temporary job at the police department, manning the phone and radio logs and assisting the police gathering information. He would do this from June to August. Because of summertime, most of the police took summer vacation. They took turns, so they were always down a person, and they really needed somebody to man the phones and give them a break. The central issue in all of this was the Vietnam War. This was factoring into the life choices of a lot of young men. He was in graduate school. His professor said that the U.S. was meddling in a civil war in Vietnam, and it made John rethink his attitude about it. The entire country, especially young people, were rethinking the war. In 66, a guy called Kerriman testified at Fulbright hearings and said, there are no specific U.S. interests at stake in Vietnam except the vague ideological idea of anti-communism. McDonough became skeptical and then opposed, and he was very rational. He believed that the only real conversation should be about a speedy withdrawal from the war. He was center-left. He was friends with mixed opinions of people with pro and con opinions about the war. He saw at work, two police would be on duty at a time, but, somebody had to be in a police car, somebody had to be at the station, and that's why he was there to do the phones. Sometimes, because it was the summertime, it would only be one police officer, so they would not be in the car unless they got called out. From midnight to 8 a.m., there was just one police officer to answer the phone at night. Kenilworth cars, there were two of them, and they had two numbers, number 50, and number 51. 12 other communities shared the same radio frequency. This is like a low population area. And McDonough said that he learned to ignore the white noise from all these other communities, and he would only go on alert when he heard the call for cars 50 and 51. He earned a whopping $150 a month. He said that a lot of the communication on the radio, because it was an open radio, were terse because of monitoring by the press. His job was to call the police cars that were, if they were out, about prowlers or kids doing mischief, and then log all these complaints in a book. And then he would do things like look up license plates and that kind of thing. And this is pre-internet. So Sunday, there was a patrol police officer and John. He sees this guy eating lunch, and they got a call about self-harm. And McDonough said the police were more concerned about having their lunch interrupted than they were about the fate of this person, So he started his job about the same time as William and wife and child moved back in with William's parents. And he was on duty for many of these calls about William and Richard. And there's a police officer who's going to come up here a lot in the story, whose name is Vernon Roddy. He survived every other member of the mid-1960s Kenilworth Police Department, and he remembers the Thornsons. So the author was able to talk to some original people involved in this situation. It was an interesting family, to say the least, Roddy remarked in 2012. When asked if he remembered if William Thornton possessed any guns, Roddy replied, "Oh, yeah, a lot of weapons, guns, that sort of thing. He was a dangerous individual, just crazy," is putting it mildly. Roddy also recalls handcuffing Thornton at the latter's home while arresting him on a warrant. He was hiding upstairs. His father called the police and said, come get him. He was the only police officer on patrol this particular Sunday and of the harm, and he called Wilmette for backup because Thornson's reputation for violence preceded him, and William was strong. Also, for heaven's sake, Roddy remembered this particular story. A day in 65, when Thornson's brother Richard was jailed for a brief time at the Kenilworth police station, the younger Thornson told officers who were present, including Vernon Roddy, "This is going to be a bad year this year." And approximately 2 months later, Richard Thornson was dead. Chapter 6, Saturday. So, I think I'm going to stop here because we're going to get into the important story here. We've done our background now. We know the geography and basically what the property was like, and we know what was going on in the neighborhood. There's more, so stay tuned for that. And we know just a little bit about the family, and so now we're going to get down to something that's the heart of the story, right? So let's stop here and we'll proceed on the next video. So this is the end of video number 1, and I'll be back with video number 2. Stay tuned, and I hope you're interested in this. I find the lack of understanding of this criminal behavior, what's behind it, is really interesting. I think today police might be more aware of what this kind of ongoing behavior could indicate, and maybe be a little more on the alert and a little bit more likely to put 2 and 2 together. These cops were just reacting. They weren't really doing anything to prevent a problem. I think that's significant. So I'll be back. Thanks for watching Slongafoil.